This year, as the US government argues over whether to spend another almost $1 trillion to stimulate an economy ravaged by COVID-19, and the UK government likely to have increased public sector borrowing by £215 billion this year, and with central banks lowering interest rates to often below zero and going mad with QE, is there a chance that they might be doing too much? It sounds unlikely, doesn't it? But some are saying that with all this extra money, when the economy bounces back, it's going to bring with it hefty inflation. So is that something we need to keep an eye on? Or is inflation a thing of the past, at least for now? We'll look at all of that today on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. So, Steve, there are those who argue that the economy is being overstimulated, and the reason they give is that the effect of the downturn that we've been seeing with COVID-19 is immediate, because we see shops close, demand falls, jobs are lost, production decreases. But the impact of any stimulus that we put in, whether it's fiscal stimulus or whether it's central banks pretending that they're doing stimulus as well, that takes longer for the effects of that to be felt. So you can over-respond. That's the argument. Is there any credence to that argument whatsoever?
Oh, well, one thing that does matter, of course, in economics is timing. Of course, economists are experts in that because they leave time completely out of them and also haven't got a bloody clue as to what the timing actually is. But yes, if you this is one reason that, for example, Minsky was actually critical of discretionary fiscal policy. He's more in favour of fiscal policy being built in a sense of tax rules, the increasing rate of tax during a boom, diminishing during a slump, because of the timing issue. Because if you get the timing wrong, then you can be applying you're trying to slow the economy down when it already is doing that, and so on, and reverse.
Right. But what he's suggesting there might work in a normal cycle, but it wouldn't work.
This is not normal.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So it wouldn't apply this year.
I think it's a ridiculous worry to have right now. I mean, given what the COVID has done to the global economy, it's pretty crazy to say, we shouldn't be trying to help it recover too much. And what worries me the most, as usual, is what happens during has happened during this crisis is an unprecedented increase in the level of corporate debt. If you look at the American data, and which is the main one that I tend to keep my eye on, and we've had a cyclical trend towards higher levels of corporate debt before COVID struck. So if we go back to before we can actually formally date it, which is about 2000, it was in the beginning of 2020, before any borrowing related to COVID started turning up in the data, then we had the highest level of corporate debt since the Great Depression. If you go back to, say, the 2010 peak, for example, the level of corporate debt was about 70% of GDP, or before COVID hit, it had hit 75%. But that was actually with a gradual process starting. It bottomed out at about 65, 66%. It rose over the last 5 years to about 75%. But it's gone from 75%. I was actually trying to get my cursor not moving. 75 to 78% in 2 months.
Well, I mean, that would be great, though, wouldn't it? If that was companies saying, look, we've lost some of our competitors. Here's an opportunity for us to grow. So we're going to borrow to grab more market share. But I sense that is not what's happening. No,
I think what's happening is people are saying we've got our cash flow's screwed. We've still got to pay the landlord. So we're going to access our line of credit. If we have
so you think it's very much small business that's doing this? Because, large business is either doing well or it's gone to the wall, it seems.
I think it has to be both, because this is American data, and they break it down into households and corporates. This is data from the Bank of International Settlements. And looking at the data over, 105 years, there's been nothing like this in the last 1 century. This much of an increase. So I think it just is simply emergency borrowing by corporations to be able to pay the commitments they can't themselves stop reaching, and then bang, this huge increase in debt. It's not something which is adding to productive capacity at all. It's not something which is adding to demand at all. It's simply saying we can pay the landlord fundamentally.
Yeah, and that is a concern. I mean, that would mean that there's not enough stimulus, or the stimulus is going in the wrong direction, which I think is almost certainly the case, and we can talk about that. But the reason that some people, and I must admit, it's a very small number. I mean, even sort of conventional economists are saying that let's not worry about inflation. But there are a few people out there saying, when it all comes bouncing back, we're going to have to worry about inflation because there's so much money swilling about the economy. So the OECD forecast for all OECD countries is that in Q2 next year, inflation will peak at just at 1.8% before slipping down to 1.5%, but then back up to 1.8% by the end of 2022. So that's a way off. And they're saying places like Europe, it's going to be much slower. But they reckon US inflation is going to hit 2.8% in Q2 next year. So there is a danger, isn't there, that central banks and particularly governments who are looking for an argument to become more cautious, fearing inflation might rise more, will look at that and say, well, this is a reason to pull back. 2.8% inflation by Q2 next year.
Yeah, well, that's the central bank forecast, and they have been completely wrong about the rate of inflation for the last 20 years. So I think that's what you're getting is a set of predictions out of neoclassical economic models, which is if you look at the predictions they've made versus what actually happens with the real data, all you get is these upward predictions of the rate of inflation and downward prediction of the downward path of the actual rate of inflation. So again, I think this is neoclassical economists fighting the last war with the technology they have that lost the war anyway. So, I'm just looking at when you made it, I hadn't looked at that data myself for some time, so I've just actually loaded my inflation data and taking a look at it now. And if you go back to, let's say, that's a good date, back to 1991, you had a 6% rate of inflation, and the trend from that point, if you go further back again, like 1980, you had 15%. But the trend since that peak, which was hit just before Volcker slammed the brakes on the American economy by whacking up interest rates to the order of 17%, the trend has just been downward all the while. Yeah. And the most recent data, looking in 2020 May, and May hit annual rate of inflation of 0.1%, and it's now back to up to 1% over the but the trend is just down. I think the expectation.
Well, I mean, more people are talking about deflation, aren't they, rather than inflation? That prices are going to go down because there's subdued demand. But one of the arguments for inflation is that it's being driven by through producer prices. If they rise, the cost of goods increases. So it doesn't matter about wage push inflation. It's the cost of production. Although it's hard to fathom that one out because it's been rising a bit in the United States. But we look at China, which is doing pretty well right now. Producer prices, the PPI as they call it, producer price index, is actually falling. So the more of an argument for deflation rather than inflation.
Yeah, I mean, overall, if we're just looking at a world without climate change, then my expectation would be continuous deflation. That's why I called my site debt deflation when I first started doing this stuff 15, 20 years ago. And that's just the overall trend. It's got two elements to it. One is the impact of private debt, and this is the complex one that I found in doing my Minsky modelling. The increasing level of private debt is paid for by the working class. With the feedbacks that exist in the system, even when I've got in my model, when I model how capitalists doing the borrowing to build literal factories, no Ponzi behaviour at all, etc., etc. Because there are three social classes you need to worry about: capitalists who are building the goods, building the factories, and make the goods and services. Workers who
good
work
guys.
in those. Pardon?
I'm just simplifying. They're the good guys. Then you got the workers who are the good guys,
and then you got the bankers who are the wankers. And as you have an increasing level of debt driving up the debt levels, which we've been seeing, as you know, until the financial crisis hit, and then now happening again to some extent. That increasing debt means that more money goes to bankers, and it actually. The dynamics are such that the capitalists sort of stay around much the same level. The increasing share going to bankers comes at the expense of workers. Now, the workers, in turn, are the main source of inflation. So if you have a lower amount going to workers overall, they've got less bargaining power. The rate of the inflation falls. And when I model it, that's what I get a tendency towards deflation. So that's still my expectation. If we didn't have climate change in there, then that would be.
We are going to look at Steve's. We're going to look at Steve's predictions for climate change next week on the podcast. But that's it for this shortened edition of the Debunking Economics podcast. If you want to listen to this discussion in full, you need to become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen, or you can subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com. Catch you again next week for the final Debunking Economics podcast of 2020. What a year it's been. I'm Phil Dobbie. He's Steve Keen. Have a great Christmas. See you next week.